sick, so we're just going to start, not to delay it too much. And my name is Agata Meysner, and I'm the Global Relations Lead at Visegrad for Sustainability. Welcome to our first talk in a series. Today we're going to talk about the influence of COVID-19 on specifically environmental sustainability. This is the first talk in our series that we're currently organizing. There's another one coming up on social impacts and another one on economic impacts. We have invited very inspiring speakers to discuss the impact on COVID in the Visegrad region and beyond. And we'll start with short introductions. I'll tell you a bit more about who we are, what V4SDG does, and then I'll introduce you to our speaker today. We'll then move on to the discussion, and we'll finish off with the Q&A for today from all our guests. Just as a, before we move to an introduction, as a technical information, if you would like to ask a question, you can do that also during the discussion using the Q&A function. If you look at the bottom of the screen, you should have the Q&A function, and you can ask your questions there. If you have any technical problems, then please use the chat. There's a Levente from V4SDG. He'll be happy to assist you if you have any problems with the sound, or if you have any problems with seeing some sort of content, or if you don't understand how to ask questions, then you can use the chat function. As we also announced in the email, please mind that the talk will be recorded. Well, let me introduce V4SDG for you. It's an organization that is strengthening leadership and partnership sustainability in Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, and Slovakia, so the Visegrad region. At V4SDG, we're currently running a lot of different projects. One of them is a think tank of 100 young professionals that work on sustainability in various different fields. We're also building the first online sustainability platforms of the region that's called V4SDG Connect, and we're going to launch it in the coming weeks. In the last 2 years, we have also organized various conferences in each V4 country's capital. And in September, we'll return to Hungary for the Budapest Sustainability Exchange. During that conference, we'll gather young professionals, public and private sectors, academia, and various civil society organizations from the Visegrad Group and the EU in general. If you're interested to join our event in September, there's more information on it on our website. You can have a look there, and you can also register. The registrations are now open. And if you have any other questions to me or to any of our team members, you can also have a look at our website to see the team members. And every team member has an email address that you can use to ask specific questions related to either the regional activities or the global activities that we're currently running. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our speaker today, László Pintér. László Pintér is a professor and head of the Department of Environmental Sciences and Policy at the Central European University. Can you hear me? Okay, sorry, I think it's stopped for a moment. He's a professor and head of department at of Environmental Sciences and Policy at the Central European University, and he's also a senior fellow at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. László has been working on sustainable development issues for nearly 30 years, and he has worked with various international organizations such as OECD, the World Bank, the United Nations Development Programme, and many leading think tanks and consulting companies. It is our pleasure to have you here today, László, and I'll give you the floor for your introduction.
Okay, thank you, Agata. First of all, it's a pleasure to speak at the V4SDG event, and I've had various interactions with the organization, which were usually informal. So this is, I think, my first possibility to appear more formally. So that's much valued. Although I think this is probably still an informal event. So in terms of introduction, so we did discuss a number of questions. How do you want to sort of manage this, Agata? Do you want to go this question by question and you ask questions and I answer, or should I just go through the questions? Because I can also do that.
I can just go for the questions, that's fine.
Okay, good. So, so the first, of course, we are discussing here the implication of COVID-19 on the environment, more narrowly speaking, and on the sustainability agenda and the SDGs in more general. And the way I'm going to address this is the foray into this question initially is perhaps more narrowly focused on the environment dimension, but as a systems person, I would really broaden that picture and try to speak to the broader sustainability implications, or at least the way I see them. Now, I also have to add a caveat right at the beginning. I think this is first and foremost an enormous learning exercise for all of us, everyone, and I think we collectively and individually have to be really humble when we try to speak to the potential implications, simply because the system is just so complex, and because I think as this epidemic is already producing surprises, it will continue to do so, and not even just at the first order level as direct consequences, but also at the level of second order consequences that may actually contradict first order consequences, and I will explain what I mean on that. So that humility is very important, and of course I also will have to say that I'm not an epidemiologist even nearly. So I will speak with that humility in mind, I hope. So the first question that was raised in previous conversations before this this webinar is COVID-19 really a relief for nature? And perhaps the one of my answers to that is that it is, although we are seeing some interesting pictures of fish in Venice and drops in air pollution and some of the megacities, people living in megacities suddenly being able to see the sky. I think those are sort of quick reactions from the system to this crisis. I think from the longer term perspective, it is definitely too early to tell. In the fact that there are some of these short symptoms, I don't think that that means that these conditions are going to stay. And so while I do applaud these positives, and I think they are actually producing significant, in some cases, in many cases perhaps, significant short-term benefits for people who live in those conditions. I think on the longer consequences that I think we should, as sustainability people, we should really be concerned about. I think those are still a question. I think we also have to recognize, again, as complex as the world is, that there are probably also some negatives, and I was trying to see if I can think about some negatives, and one obvious negative is that you might not think about is this epidemic is probably sharply increasing the volume of, for instance, hospital waste. It is possibly also increasing perhaps some of the production of packaging waste, because people are more concerned about reusing or reusable plates and cups and so on, and even in public places. So I think. Okay, I mean, these are not based on any data, but just an indication that as if we are trying to answer this type of a question, I think we should try to have a realistic and balanced perspective. So so I think so I mentioned this idea of first order and second order impacts, and the first order impacts are the ones like I mentioned, for instance, as a result of a drop in transportation. There is a drop in air pollutions. We all know we also see a significant drop in the emission of various air pollutants, not just non-greenhouse gas types, but also CO2 and others. So that does, in a sense, provide perhaps short-term relief. Although articles that just came out recently very instructively point out that even this very significant drop in, for instance, emissions that we see now, they are not at the scale that would be necessary in order to get on a track where we see where we get on a transition pathway to a stabilized climate. That is, I think, very instructive and useful to think about in the context of the scale and the magnitude and complexity of the challenge that we are facing, quite apart from this crisis. What I mean on second order impacts, those would be impacts that are a consequence of other potentially non-environmental type changes as a result that result from the epidemics. And one that I think stands out to me, at least, is the impact on for instance, fragile ecosystems. So we know that a lot of people who already live in poverty, they very often tend to overuse ecosystems, and if poverty is increasing, it is possible that the use of fragile ecosystems will also shoot up on some time scale. Other types of second-order impacts could be that if companies, for instance, or public utilities start facing economic pressure and have to let people go, or don't have resources, for instance, to maintain infrastructure, they can have, again, environmental impacts. And so that's so there are second order type implications, and so I think whether it's a relief for nature or not, I think this is a question that there isn't a very simple answer to. So there was a second related question to this, and by the way, if you want to stop me, Agata, any questions, any comments, you just stop me. Or also, you also watch the time, so please also warn me if I'm speaking over time.
Sure.
Okay, so the second related question is, could a rapid economic recovery backlash on the environment, could it result in a backlash? Well, I mean, the main point there is that at the moment, economic growth, economic development, more broadly speaking, is quite strongly coupled to environmental impacts. And as long as this coupling between economic growth and economic development and GDP and the environmental impacts is there, then if economic growth comes back and GDP spikes again, and this becomes sort of a V-shaped crisis, then unfortunately it will also contribute to increases in environmental in pressures on the environment. I think that is I think that the possibility of that is not small, because in order to move into a completely different type of trajectory in terms of consumption habits, in terms of technology, in terms of the way we build and run and manage our buildings, the way we produce energy, the way we produce food. Those are not systems that change very rapidly. You can't stop them, and we did sort of stop these to some extent as a result of this crisis. But you can already see in the media that for for some good and for perhaps not so good reasons, there is a pressure to get back exactly to the point where we were before the crisis. It is, when I said for good reasons, of course, the good reason is that there are a lot of people who lost their jobs or who are on pause and have their livelihood compromised, and that's fully understandable politically and otherwise. That you do have to recreate conditions where people can like that. On the other hand, and that's a typical sustainability dilemma, is that we know that we were, even before this crisis, we were in a high risk trajectory to unsustainability. So in a sense, so even if we get back to levels before the crisis, I think that's a very Pyrrhic victory, because as this quote that I think was posted on the leaflet of this webinar was basically that situation carries the seeds of much larger calamities in them. And I'm not thinking only about climate. Climate, of course, is perhaps the most significant, but the many others, from chemicals to the problems of drinking water, to the loss of biodiversity. So we were not on a sustainable trajectory. So that would be a very short-term win. The other question,
I was wondering on that point, because you talked about how we weren't on track for sustainability anyways, and there have been a lot of environmental topics that were very relevant and have been widely discussed in the last weeks and months. Since the pandemic took off, we've basically seen some efforts from business sectors to use it as an excuse to weaken or delay certain environmental legislation, for example, from the car and agricultural sectors. And I was wondering, how can we respond to these calls by the business lobby groups?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I actually don't consider business a homogeneous entity with regard to their perspective on sustainability. Maybe you could say that a couple of decades ago, but by now, if you look around, there are actually very strong business interests that are quite sympathetic to the sustainability cause, not just necessarily because they are nice but it's actually part of their business model. So so that's one thing that I think there is a part of a business sector that actually can be a partner in building up arguments for an even much stronger sustainability transition. And so that's one thing. On the other hand, of course, you're right. We have business interests that are very much grounded in maintaining the status quo. I think that and they use usual ways of having an influence. And I think one of the important, besides the political possibilities where they exist, what is important is that there should be very clear communication of the risks of loosening the standards. Mm-hmm. I think risk is an interesting concept because it's as sort of intangible as it is. For instance, there are entities such as insurance companies for whom it's actually very concrete, and I think if we put or frame the sort of unsustainability in terms of risk, I think that's something that society, especially after this type of a calamity, might better understand. So I think communication and framing of the risks is perhaps an important one.
But do you think, so just to ask a follow-up question, and of course, I mean, in my question, I didn't mean that all the business is necessarily, sure, has a negative impact on sustainability, but just in a way that you say that we have to be very clear about the risks and very clear about the impacts, but haven't we been very clear about the impact? Haven't we talked enough about the impacts of climate change, and especially that, of course, in the times of pandemic, that there's no, I mean, the pandemic, of course, is a completely different situation that we haven't really faced before, but it is not an excuse to weaken these environmental ambitions, because it provides even more an opportunity, I think, to rethink the way we want to function, and to rethink the economy that we want to be in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think it is definitely an opportunity. Unfortunately, you will also see that there will be businesses that because of the pressure on the social side, they will argue that the priority should be jobs. Mm-hmm. That's and the livelihood of people. And I think that's where communication is one thing, but I think maybe also that's where some policy levers could play a role, because as we are rebuilding, I mean, there are some sectors that I would say that they are a write-off, but they already they were affected to a level that they are not going to bounce back to a level that they were before the crisis. I suspect air travel might be one of those, and some of these sectors are actually going to be sort of probably quasi-permanently or permanently effective. They'll probably be saved with significant injection of cash from public sources, but how much public money goes to these types of sectors versus going to other sectors that are much more in sync with a sustainability transition? I think that is a big question. Where should society focus its effort and sort of balance or take in that sort of saving? Where should we invest most? And that's where that I think is important, because for instance, the subsidy agenda, like rethinking subsidies, for instance, to some of the unsustainable sectors. It's been around for quite a long time, but for many reasons, that agenda couldn't really pick up. But perhaps in a crisis where the baseline is shifting, that's when the political systems can and probably should be more creative. This is not a new thing. In 2008, when we had the financial crisis, there were a couple of countries, not too many, that there were a few that started experimenting with green economic packages. South Korea was one. I don't think they did it at the necessary scale. I'm not suggesting that they stuck with it. I'm not even suggesting that it was hugely impactful, but there were some attempts. And I think it would be really important to see, how that happened and why, and try to, mobilize also public support for this. Because I think the public became more sensitive to some of these long-term issues, and not just in the public health and sphere.
Yeah, well, you talked about how I mean, it is a potential opportunity to think, where does our public money go? And I mean, there has been a very strong push from civil society, especially at the EU level, and even a petition to make sure that the bailouts we offer actually come with environmental standards, so that it is not offering money for the sake of offering money, but there really is a kind of sustainability a narrative involved in this. So maybe this is a good chance to move on a little bit to the civil society area, and to talk maybe, what do you think is the role of non-governmental organizations in the crisis, and how can we ensure that there is a sufficient engagement of civil society, also to guarantee that this is a very inclusive decision-making process, and that includes both the recovery from the crisis, but also beyond the mechanism that we're going to create.
Well, I think you need to push it. I think civil society can be quite useful in creating a push and a pull. And what I mean on that, and of course, civil society is very diverse and works across different scales, from small communities to EU-wide and global. But I think on the push side, I would go back to the idea of risk. I think the risks associated with an unsustainable return to the pre-crisis conditions needs to be made clear. That some of that is not new information. You might say that of course the discourse about climate risk, the discourse about biodiversity loss, the discourse about risk related to water and so on. Those are not new. But again, I think society became more sensitive to the idea of risk and its consequences, and I think that's civil society could play a role in repackaging and communicating these risks and of course also mobilizing. I mean, civil society is good at mobilizing. I think on the pool side, it is important to build positive pathways and scenarios. It's not about what this type of a transition to sustainability, if I can say that, would look like. We do need positive visions, and I think again, civil society is good at engaging, and I think I see a role for engaging people at all sorts of levels, from the community scale and up, and in various sectors, in conversations about what type of a post-crisis, post-COVID-19 world would you like, and that conversation can talk about also about the experiences of the crisis, like what were the negatives and were there any positives? Did this reorient people's thinking? Did they did they go into a different mindset? Do they want to go back exactly to where they were before the crisis in terms of many things, consumption and production habits, food security, and so on and so on.
Yeah, maybe speaking of food security, because this is especially an important topic when we talk about COVID-19 and its impact, because we have seen that there's kind of this growing emphasis on a local sustainable agriculture and kind of stepping away from the globalized supply chains. So I was wondering, what, in your opinion, would then be the role, also of the local communities, because they have largely been very, very active in this, and there has been a lot of also civil society talking about the topics. I was wondering, how do you see this issue?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I of course, this is a very common sort of aspect. I think this the present crisis that supply chains are being shortened. I think what is the question with regards to this is, if there are some possible gains and positive effects, what would it take to lock in gains? It's one thing that some people and families and communities, shifted to consume locally and consume sustainably and so on. Yeah. But if the situation changes and the stores get open and transport again is possible, and imports from faraway places are becoming possible, would they stick to that, or would they just switch right back? I think to some extent that is a conversation that is an aspect of a mindset. Are people conscious about, do they realize other values in this? Let's say producing their own food in their own community, for instance. do they recognize that this might not be just food? It also might be about social connections. It might also be about creating livelihoods for others. And I think, and that goes back to your earlier questions about for instance, civil society organizations. In order to do this on the long run, I think you need capacity. I mean, there were many people, I think, who were caught in a situation where their normal food supply might dry up, and they are forced to rely on their own means without necessarily having the tools, the know-how, the access to land, and so on. So I think it puts and I think that's where perhaps civil society groups can step in. And that's just food. That's just one sector. But in order to build a more sort of environmentally acceptable or radically more acceptable post-crisis world, it needs significant capacity. It doesn't happen from one day to the next. And that capacity is needed at the level of individuals and families and communities, but of course also at the higher level. So I do see a role, perhaps a bigger role for civil society, among others, in building capacity for a green, just type post recovery society. It is happening, but it's not happening at the right scale, of course.
Yeah, of course. No, I would definitely agree. But I do think that as much as the individual level and the local level are very important, and that civil society obviously has a very big impact on what's happening, in the end, what is also incredibly important is our good policies, our policies that are really reaching for sustainability, and that also promote collaboration between countries, and maybe that's also something that we can talk about, because the COVID crisis really exposed that in many cases we do not collaborate enough in the EU, and the countries do not collaborate enough, and there is this lack of kind of solidarity and this strong regional and international collaboration. So I was wondering, since WIG4SDG largely focuses on the Visegrad countries, how do you see this? How could we ensure, and how could we learn from this? How could we ensure stronger regional collaboration between the Visegrad countries?
Yeah, of course. Well, I mean, I'm not a Visegrad country specialist as such, so I have to sort of preface that. But I think the issue is that, of course, some collaboration is happening. It's a question of collaboration about what. So what's on the agenda, and I think the Visegrad countries actually have quite a significant potential now, in the sense that by overall European and I would say also global standards, they demonstrated reasonable ability to deal with this crisis, and some aspects, I would say, of this crisis, and I think it would be important to start adding and expanding that agenda. I mean, the responses were not necessarily a result of regional collaboration, but there were some common patterns, and I think there are also some other patterns that are somewhat perhaps common in this region that might also be interesting more broadly. And to go back to the earlier point, I think compared with some other parts of Europe, for sure, the traditions of food production and the role of local communities in basically creating their own livelihoods is perhaps stronger. So I think looking across borders for good practices, looking for opportunities to harmonize policies across countries, and trying to recognize what the links to the European common European agenda from within the region are, and make those more explicit. I think that would be important, because there's still, of course, as we know, there is some animosity, but I think with some effort, I think there is also possible to find much more common perspectives.
Yeah, well, speaking of let's say harmonizing the policies and then kind of working across regions, we're actually also working at B4SDG on that. There we have an advocacy project ongoing right now for sustainability cooperation minimum, which would be which is basically a proposal coming from major youth actors in the region for sustainable policies to be introduced really in collaboration with all the countries, and that is something that we also believe is very important. But you mentioned the European level and the kind of international level, connecting what's happening in the region, kind of making sure that we find the good practices and that are also connected to the EU level. So I was wondering, also basing on your experience, what do you think is the importance of the European Green Deal that is very widely discussed right now in the recovery from COVID-19?
Well, actually, I'm not sure the Green Deal is really discussed as widely as, particularly in the Visegrad countries, as it could be. So that's probably number one. I know it is a significant issue for sure, but at least from where I sit, I'm not sure that that discussion is broad enough. So I think that's probably number one. I think there is an awareness raising issue, and maybe that's where also, besides others, of course, civil society can play a role, but obviously also business and government at all levels. So that's number one. I think the other is that when the Green Deal was created, of course, there was no COVID-19, so we have to remember that, it is possible. There are different scenarios. On one scenario, it is possible that the crisis and the need to invest in a recovery, it might risk some of the Green Deal objectives, simply because the resources that would need to be spent will be spent on other aspect, other issues, and not Green Deal. On the other hand, if in another scenario, if I think the Green Deal, from the Green Deal perspective, it should also be possible to argue that some of the priorities in the Green Deal, they can also contribute to recovery, and then I'm thinking about the social and the economic perspective. I mean, there are significant policy levers and investment in sectors that are fully compatible with a sustainability scenario. So I don't know which way this is going to go, but I do hope that arguments will be made that maybe a Green Deal plus can be created that maximizes not just the Green Deal's environmental potential, but also its socioeconomic positive impacts. And so I'm not sure that I suspect that conversation must be going on, but I think that is needed, and I think it's probably needed not just in Brussels. I think that's needed also at the country level.
Well, let me just move on to the last question in our discussion, and then we can take some questions from the audience. So we've been talking about the strategy and the way forward and how can we recover from the crisis. And obviously, when we talk about sustainability and when we talk about a strategy, SDGs come into play. So I was wondering, how do you think Agenda 2030 and SDGs could relate to the crisis, and how can we apply the lessons learned to what's going on right now? Can we use it as a mechanism, as kind of a way to kind of guide our way forward.
Yeah. Well, I think one important sort of attribute of the SDGs is that, as very often said, they are not just distinct goals; they are actually a system of goals. So, if you really want to deal with the SDG agenda in a serious way, those interactions between the different goals, as they make sense in any given country, they should be taken into account. So it sort of forces that systems perspective, and I think that is. I'm not saying that is happening, but it is happening in some places. So if we can carry that type of a perspective across to the recovery, post COVID-19 recovery, I think that should help us, because there are also many of these types of interlinkages that need to be taken into account as we are kind of getting on, hopefully, on that sustainability scenario and sustainability oriented transition, where we have to put together apples and oranges, the interests of the healthcare system to employment, to biodiversity, to urban infrastructure, finance, and so on. So that has to be systematic. So that's number one. The other one that I would, there are three things that I would highlight. The second one is the long-term orientation and the goal orientation in the SDGs. So that, I think, is also important, that it forces us, again, at different levels, to think longer term than just the typical budget cycle, months or a few years. So because some of the changes that again have to be part of, I think, the recovery, it would be helpful to think about the long-term impacts. Okay, you might we can create jobs on the short term, but what does that do to socially, environmentally, otherwise, for economic sectors on a longer time scale? 5 years, 10 years, and longer. So that long-term perspective and goal orientation is another one. And the third one for me is, which again is implicit in the SDGs, I think, is transition thinking. Is that it takes time. It's important to set goals, but it takes time to get there, and you don't get there by default. I mean, this is fairly 101 in planning, but we need a transition process with certain practices, certain things need to be phased out, and other practices need to be phased in, and that requires investment and know-how and capacity, and it requires the buy-in of society. It needs so those transition pathways, those long-term goals need to be created. So I think the COVID crisis sort of forces, to some extent, that longer-term perspective, and that's in sync with the SDGs. And then just the last point is that, of course, there are many SDGs that, as a result of the crisis, they are going to get compromised, and others will benefit. As we started this conversation with the impact on the environment, and we said that, well, there's going to be, for instance, a drop in emissions. Some, water is clean in Venice. Biodiversity is returning to cities. So there are sort of countervailing forces. How can you lock in the positives from this? And as the recovery happening, how can we make sure that it's not happening by actually losing those gains that are clearly gains?
Yeah, maybe this is actually a very good moment to move on to the questions, because we have one question that's very much related to this, and that is, what are the three most important areas, in your opinion, where the crisis offers a unique opportunity for replanning from the perspective of environmental impact?
Wow, I don't have a pre-cooked list. One that I think I might put some hope in is the rethinking of consumption, because I think we with the impact on supply chains, I think society at different levels, was forced to basically um, make ends meet with less, and 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 as a result of that, perhaps there might be a shift in mindsets and consciousness, in the sense that that people realize that consuming less is not necessarily bad. In fact, it can be quite good and positive. So that would be one thing, and I do hope that some part of society will get hooked on this. So, and that's consumption, of course, is very broad. So that's one. What would be a second? Perhaps this, and I don't know, that's probably not a sector, but in terms of public finance, there will be significant new resources coming into play, and of course there will be many hands held out for those resources. But as these decisions are made, I think it would be very important to create criteria for green investment in some of the most critical sectors. And I'm thinking, certainly energy. I'm thinking about transport. I'm thinking about land use, and I'm thinking about green infrastructure, buildings, and so on. So I think that's so. Besides consumption, I think finance is important. Maybe I'll mention a third that is might not entirely fit this list. I think R&D is going to be very important. Research and development to now that we live through this critical experience, and some of the sectors of the economy or solutions are clearly not not robust enough, and we clearly need more better solutions. So I think there is a need for more investment and thinking with the participation of experts and the public about what types of solutions are really consistent with a recovery, but also sort of creating the green transitions that are important.
Yeah, thank you. We have another question which was actually sent during the registration, which is globalization as we know over? And we'll see deglobalization tendencies. We will see a greener, environmentally conscious tendencies in the government's approaches.
Well, you cannot stop into the same river twice, as they say. So in that sense, it's not just a question of whether globalization is over. It's more like what kind of globalization. I think it would be too naive and simplistic to say that this is the end of what we simplistically call globalization. But it is also clear that there are many aspects of globalization that we'll have to change. I mean, one thing, globalization would have not happened without the massive infuse of fossil energy over the last many years, and we know that that era is one way or another is going to come to the end. So we have to have. I mean, and some aspects of globalization will likely continue, but it would have to be much more selective. And some of the risks became much clearer, through the transmission of pathogens or the transmission of invasive species that are just as problematic. So we did have a very smart globalization, I would say.
Yeah. Okay, well, let me take one more question, and then we'll have to finish the webinar. Maybe just to finish on a slightly positive note, there's a question: what are the positive conclusions, if any, from the current crisis? And if there are positive outcomes for sustainability, how can we keep momentum to retain them?
Mm-hmm. Well, to me, the most positive is perhaps the creation of social capital and collaboration at the mainly at the local level, but also to some degree internationally. I think in order to manage this much bigger transition, not just to bounce back from COVID-19, but to address the many other problems. I think we need collaborative mechanisms of all kinds and at all levels, and I think it's very important that countries, and to go back again to the region, because I think we saw also some really positive examples of collaboration happening, from my village to other levels, and we need those types of capacities over the coming years. I think that's, to me, is a positive experience.
Well, thank you very much for your time. I think it has been an incredibly interesting experience, and I know we have some more questions to discuss, but I'm afraid that we do not have more time yet. But I'm sure that if you reach out with these questions, it will be possible also to get some answers. But just to highlight at the end that this is the first talk in the series. We were discussing here mostly the environmental impact, but we'll also be discussing the social and the economic impact in the coming talks that you can still register for. And I would also like to invite you again to join our Budapest Sustainability Exchange in September and to learn more about our projects on the website. And thank you again, László, for this great talk. I think you have provided us with a lot of things to think about, and for sure many different topics to discuss. I would also like to thank all of you who joined us today, and to again invite you to ask questions for the further talks, and to follow our social media for any future events. I don't know if László, you wanted to add something at the end. Please go ahead.
Well, I just want to thank V4SDG for initiating this series of conversations. I think it's needed, it's well timed, and I'm looking forward to continuing this interaction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everybody, and enjoy your evening.
Okay, bye.
Bye.